everyone, and welcome to the Voices of Music Therapy podcast. I'm your host, Brian Locascio, and our guest today is a professor at the University of Kansas. His teaching centers around musicianship, music therapy philosophy, and development. His research interests include musicianship in music therapy, percussion for interventions, and andragogy, as well as philosophy behind music therapy. I would like to welcome our guest for today, Dr. Bill Matney.
Thank you, Brian. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to start by just asking you, what is music therapy?
Always such an interesting question to be asked and a challenging one to answer.
Yes.
I will do my best to be concise here. It's interesting to think about the way I teach this in the intro class when I work with the freshmen. I actually give them two definitions. I'm not going to do that today.
Okay.
I'm going to give you my own description is probably a better term than definition for me. I think of music therapy as the use of music to promote health in a range of domains through a relationship that includes a qualified music therapist as well as client or clients.
And for those listening and maybe they haven't heard of music therapy or what it entails, how would you define a qualified music therapist?
A qualified music therapist is one who receives the appropriate training at a university, which includes a 4-year set of coursework as well as an internship. And in the United States, we are pretty big on the board certification exam as well. And while I want to pay respect to international differences, we in the United States pretty commonly expect that board certification as a part of the process.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for talking on that. And for you, how does music therapy work?
How does it work? Oh, what an interesting question. And it's also challenging to answer concisely.
Yes.
I am big on the active music in my work. And I think about the active music doing things in multiplication. And that's where it gets really complicated quickly. So there are things that are happening neurologically. Yes, absolutely, I agree. There are things that are happening sociologically, and I absolutely agree with that too. We can say that there are things happening psychologically, which somewhat overlaps with neurology and somewhat overlaps with sociology as well. So my take is that there's quite a bit going on. There is not one specific mechanism that's going to dictate what I do, but I think contextually about my work. So whoever I'm working with at the time, I'm seeking to meet them where they're at and find how music can play a role. And if there is some particular neurologic effect that the research has demonstrated, then I might go that route. But I'm going to use the evidence base and its strengths, but also be aware of its own limitations in terms of how it may or may not translate to my work in the moment.
Yeah. Would you be willing to give an example of an intervention within a session?
Oh, goodness. I'll tell you what, I will, but knowing you well enough, you'll be able to humor me here. Can you give me a little bit of a context to work with?
Oh, I would love to. Let's have it be. We love to do this within the university setting. For those who aren't aware of music therapy education, we like to make up scenarios. Let's have an adolescent with diagnosed with autism and with, let's say autism and some type of attention deficit disorder. And they are working on having their, activities of daily living.
So working on activities of daily living related to attention and maybe focus due to sensory needs, sensory deficits. And we're obviously being very hypothetical here, so we're just going to kind of go with that. So something I might do in terms of activities of daily living, like, let's say, tying a shoe. Tying a shoe, actually, if we break it down, if we think back to when we learned it, it took a while to get to that point, right? There's a lot of steps to it. We don't think about it that way now, but right? We've got to create the tension on the shoelaces, get them as taut as we can while being comfortable, and then we tie that knot, and that takes a few tasks in itself, getting things moving around, and then the bow and so on. So in that instance, and I've actually done this with an adolescent diagnosed somewhat similarly to what you described, create a song that allows me to set up the steps for that. And I think in that instance, I actually did what we call a piggyback song, which means I took a song that already exists, is familiar, and was able to write new words over it. And for this particular client, that wasn't distracting in any way. The song was very simple, and it was repetitive in terms of the melody. So I was able to provide those tasks in a way that their brain could retain the information over time. Of course, while we were working on that song, we had to go one task at a time, but eventually they could layer all of that information together. I'm not going to try to remember and sing that song to you right now.
Yeah, I was going to say, do you want to plug the song real quick?
Good. It's been like 15 years, so I couldn't remember it now. But we were able to work on that and certainly move towards success on that. They became much stronger at that task over time.
Yeah, thank you. I think that was a really great example for people listening in who may not have that background of what music therapy is.
It's interesting to think about the power of music in that way. I mean, sometimes we refer to it as music as a mnemonic device, music as a way to remember something. And if we go back to the simplicity of learning the ABCs, I mean, it's a great example for all of us, right? Music has that ability to capture our attention and maintain our attention through its use of rhythm and melody. And there are actually neurological studies that show why that can be the case and how predictability helps us in those ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Music therapy, just in its Western sense now, it's existed for a long time as just the very first form of communication and understanding. So it's no surprise to me that we've led into that as a profession in the United States and where that's come from. So for you, I would also like to know what led you to music therapy.
Oh goodness, how much time do we have? So I'll tell you a story. I started out, and you may know some of this, Brian, I don't know, but obviously the audience does not. I started out playing music in underground garage bands, basically, in kind of the suburbs of Houston, and had band members that lived in Houston proper and would travel to their houses, and we practiced. And eventually we became good enough and well-known enough that we would tour and record, and we could go to Washington, D.C. and have 200 people show up because they knew who we were. It was fun and exciting, and it made absolutely no money whatsoever.
Yeah.
And but it was a great learning experience for me, and it was a joy and a passion for me. So over time, I realized I loved music, and if I was going to actually do it for a living, I needed to start kind of pursuing it in ways that I would be able to make money at it. So at that time, I thought, well, I'm going to go to the University of North Texas and study jazz. So I'm going to start studying at a community college and really work on that. And so I did that for a while and then went to the University of North Texas. But during my time in Austin, before going to Denton, Texas, where UNT is, there was a Thai restaurant that I really liked. And the manager at that restaurant, we were talking one day, and she says, so what's going on with you? And I said, well, I'm going to be moving up to Denton in maybe a year. I'm looking forward to going to UNT and studying jazz. She goes, well, I'm actually going to go up to Denton too, but I'm going to go over to the other university, Texas Women's University, and study music therapy. Oh, tell me about that. And so the seed was planted as to what it was. And then I went up to North Texas, was there for a year and a half. There were many things about it that I loved. I learned so much. And then at the same time, there was something that was still missing for me regarding how I connected with people in the music. We know that performance has a way of connecting with people. We know that music education has a way of connecting with people, but it's different than the way we connect with people in music therapy. And I was missing something. So I started exploring music therapy, and everything I read just said to me, yes, this is it. And once I committed to it, I never looked back. It was just exactly what I needed. So
Wow. Yeah. I think that really speaks to how it really is a calling for a lot of people. And when you know, so cheesy, but like when you know that it's the right profession for you, you can feel it in everything that you do. So yeah. My next question for you is, what does music therapy look like currently for you? Whether, before, post pandemic, during, but just in general.
what does music therapy look like in terms of my daily life, you mean?
Yes. Yes.
I was a clinician for um, 11 years, primarily in special education, although I did work in some other areas as well. Uh, and eventually, pursued the PhD and now teach at the university where I got my PhD, and I absolutely love it. And my daily work now largely consists of teaching students. I do try to keep my um, eyes open and my hands into some clinical work in what ways I can. It's more so right now supervising practicum students. So there's an interprofessional practicum that includes music therapy students and speech language pathology students that I get to supervise and co-supervise with a speech language pathology professor. So um, that's a part of it, but a lot of it's teaching and research as well at this point. Does that kind of answer the question?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Kind of touching on just the different aspects of how it's shifted for you since becoming a professor. One of my questions that I like to ask everyone who comes on is, what do you contribute to the world of music therapy to make it an innovative process for you? Like what do you do that makes music therapy innovative?
Here's how I hope that I am providing something that people find useful and maybe innovative. The big thing for me, I was a drum set player in the rock band. I studied world music when I got to North Texas and continued to play drum set and learn jazz. And I still have this big passion for percussion instruments. So a lot of my research, including my thesis, and then so many publications after, have been about what is it that's unique about percussion in music therapy, and how do we better teach it? How do we better use it in interventions when we're working with clients? How do we philosophically underpin it so that we really rationalize what we're doing in strong ways? I think the history of my work has been a lot in the use of percussion in music therapy. And I think it's helped me to branch out into some other areas of interest, but I think it's always going to kind of be home base for me. And maybe that's the beginning of innovation. It's definitely taken me into thinking about musicianship on a broader level, which is probably something we're going to talk more about today. But I think percussion is largely where it's at. I love to play. So I love to do my best if I'm going to talk the talk, then to also walk the walk and continue to study and play instruments, but largely play the instruments that are really common in our work.
Yeah, and that actually brings us to our topic for today, which is innovation in musicianship. So I was hoping that you could talk a little bit more about what you are doing within percussion specifically at the University of Kansas right now.
So right now, every couple of years, I get to teach a class on the use of percussion in music therapy, which I'm always very excited about. This is something that I had a chance to teach at Texas Women's University after getting my master's there for a little while. And it's something I'm incredibly passionate about. It's something that probably eventually will have a chance to even make more frequent at the university and make sure that every student um, gets that directly. But it's an elective course right now, and fortunately, it's a class amongst many of our really nice music therapy electives. That this one is also popular, so that's a good thing. Um, and it's a chance to really dig into what's unique about our field and what's unique about the use of percussion in our field.
What are some areas within percussion that you have kind of explained to students coming in and how it can be useful within our field?
I think the history says, and I think this is changing somewhat, but the history shows that commonly students take a class in percussion that they're learning some snare rudiments and they're learning timpani and they're learning marimba and maybe playing four mallets. And all of those things are really cool things, but they're also things that nobody uses outside of maybe 4 or 5 rudiments. Nobody's going to use as a clinician. So the things that I'm most interested in are, what are the instruments that we commonly use? How do we learn how to play them musically? And then how do we use them clinically as well, as related to the different types of music therapy methods? And I'll describe those to you in a minute if you want, but also in relation to those particular needs that a client has. So we're starting to think about those domains of health and how we use those instruments. So let me give you an example of one of those to start. If I am looking to help a client promote their range of motion, let's say hypothetically after a stroke, they're working on range of motion and they're working with the PT, and we've already consulted with the PT on what is safe. So we're making sure that we're taking care of that consideration. And we know that that gross motor movement with the arm is going to be really important. How can I use either a djembe or a paddle drum in a musical way to help them maintain or perhaps increase that range of motion? So that would be a question I would pose, and that would be something that we would explore in that class.
Yeah, and absolutely. And it's funny that we talk about specifically with at the university what you're doing with percussion and music, because I know, like you were speaking on a little bit earlier, right now there is a disconnect, I feel like, in a lot of universities where you do get that percussion class, but the connection isn't drawn to music therapy, and that can be applied to other instruments as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's really talking about, okay, this is what I'm majoring in. Let's go ahead and apply information that I can work directly into my sessions, as opposed to making those connections after school or when you're in your internship, like getting those fostered as early as possible so that they are equipped for the real world.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. It's so incredibly important to think. One of the things that I like to frame musicianship in to help make it relevant, there are 4 ways that we experience music, and you don't isolate any of them. They overlap with each other in very unique and interesting ways, but there are 4 common ways that we experience music. One of them is to recreate music. So if I sing Somewhere Over the Rainbow, I'm recreating a song that already exists. I can be very creative with it. I could even rearrange it, right? I can do all sorts of things with the melody, but I'm still recreating a song that already existed. I can also compose music. I can compose a song that never existed before. And maybe someone will recreate that song in the future. That's awesome if they do. I can also improvise, which means I'm creating something that never existed and is never going to be redone again exactly the same. Or I can receive music, and that might mean just listening to music, or it might mean taking in music in another way, like playing a big drum and the vibrations that come off of that drum. So I can receive music in that way. So when we start thinking about those 4 methods, we're able to start applying what we might do with music in a particular environment. And we can do that with percussion instruments. If I'm going to recreate a song using percussion, there are different ways to do that. I might use something traditional. If I use a djembe, I might play something from that tradition. But I might also accompany a song with rhythm, singing Somewhere Over the Rainbow. That would also be recreating. It's kind of hybrid, kind of doing something different, but that's another way to do it. I can improvise with drums. How do I do that? Understanding how to do that helps us. I can also compose and receive music that way. So that gives us a little bit of an underpinning, and I usually try to frame things in the class with that information. It's kind of nerdy conceptual stuff, but it does help with the larger application.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I can definitely see how understanding those concepts helps you to apply them in your work. But thinking as well, one of those topics that you touched on, or those categories rather, was improvisation. And I find this one very interesting because after reviewing various schools of music therapy across the United States in particular, I noticed that only a couple of them have a class on improvisation as an actual technique, even though it's something that I would argue to say most music therapists, if not all, use at some point within their practice. So would you like to talk a little bit on that, and why you think that's not something that's been implemented within the education system?
Wow, that is a fantastic question. And I completely agree with you. You know, when I think about my own work, there was never a session that I wasn't improvising at some point. And I mean musically. I don't just mean like winging it because the plan got thrown out. I mean like musically, there's something even within the recreation that I'm doing improvisationally because it needs to happen. I'm having to be creative. I'm having to change tempos because I'm noticing something. There's a give and take between me and the client that needs me to follow, or needs me to go in a new direction to guide them. So just in that way, no matter what I'm doing, I'm improvising. I think it's really important and fair to say that a lack of understanding improvisation probably does a few things for music therapy students. If there is no improvisation, someone is going to have challenges probably with their own confidence to improvise. If they're not in the laboratory setting where you get to explore improvisation, it might be more difficult for you to feel comfortable implementing it in a session. You know, it's interesting thinking about there are certain universities that really thrive on teaching improvisation. Perhaps, and I don't know this, you may know better than me because you've been researching it, perhaps at the risk of leaving some other things out, though. Yet at the same time, I absolutely agree that without some understanding of musical improvisation and clinical improvisation, what that looks like with a client, understanding how to interact, how to take something that they're doing and do it exactly with them, or to do it after them, or to take them in a new direction. Those are important skills to have, and they transfer to everything. So I don't know if I'm getting at what you're asking or not, but it's interesting to think about.
No, yes, absolutely. And one of the big things that we talk about at the University of Kansas as an alumni of the university, rock chalk, is this idea of the therapeutic function of music. And that is utilizing all the aspects and characteristics of music, what makes music its whole self, and taking that apart and really achieving your goals. And if you don't have improvisation, how are you supposed to manipulate the music to accomplish those goals, which is the purpose of a music therapist?
Yes, absolutely. Agreed. Right? That this, in some ways, is really a great articulation of the power of this idea of the therapeutic function of music, as Dr. Hanson Abermite describes it. This way of looking at the characteristics of music, not separate from each other, but understanding what's happening from kind of characteristically through each one of them, and then enacting them together in what she refers to as synthesis, which is entirely appropriate. We can't really isolate those areas in actual practice. We can isolate them theoretically, but if we want to look at rhythm and understand how rhythm can be stimulative or sedative for somebody, at least in what shows in the research, then we have to eventually put that with whatever else we're doing, if there's a melody with it and so on and so forth. So taking those characteristics and being able to improvise with them is both important for one's confidence, but also for one's competence in regard to the clinical practice that they strive for.
I think that was really well said. One of the big things that I wanted to see from you as somebody who's been a clinician for many years is, how has music therapy education changed since you were in it, and where do you think it's going? Keeping in mind these ideas of improvisation, instruments, equity, all these different aspects that's being talked about in the buzzwords within the music therapy community.
Great question. Oh my goodness. I could talk for so long, and I'm going to get sidetracked. So you're going to have to rein me in here. You know, when I was a student, I had some wonderful professors. I actually got, in the ways that they were able to do it, I got a little bit of music technology. I got a little bit of exposure to hip hop and music therapy. I was really fortunate. Now, the way it looked then and the way it looks now would be very different. But I was able to see that those people were forward thinking and they were doing their best to give us that larger consideration of what musicianship is, which is part of what we're talking about today. It's not just guitar and piano and percussion and voice. But those have historically and appropriately been kind of the four pillars for musicianship in our field. We are now at a time when we really need to see more, in my opinion, in the way of music technology being explored, if not taught. There is an obvious challenge for even me to teach music technology. And I do my best to keep up with it, but it's still challenging because the pace at which those things are changing and the pace with which you all as a generation, or even the younger, when I say generation, I'm talking about music therapy generations, like you're about to become not the youngest generation anymore.
I know.
But the amount of change that happens, and you all can pick up on that more quickly. So in some ways, it's almost better to just set up the resources, in my opinion, than to try to teach the material, if that makes sense. It becomes more of a dialogue. So I'm kind of segueing into something here. My teaching approach, my teaching process, even in the intro class, has become much more dialogical, become much more related to having a dialogue with the students. Let me give you a really, at least for me, interesting example. So at the University of Kansas, we have historically had something that we call the Master Song List. There are a couple of things about this that are interesting. The name Master Song List no longer applies. It's not really appropriate. There was a reason it existed. Language has shifted. Language has changed. I have already proposed that we change the name to Song Resource List. We as faculty have already decided that Song Resource List needs to be much more open-ended. We have done our best to expand the genres that exist in there. So I actually had with one of your peers, but 1 year down, had this wonderful conversation about this during the conference. We spent some time chatting about it. And she told me what she was working on in internship and what songs I could add. But not only that, I've asked the intro students the same question. It was an assignment for them, and just a little engagement assignment. Look through the song resource list that I am updating and that is open-ended, and I want you to tell me what we need to add to it. Because, for example, right, I went in and I said, all right, we need rap in here. We need to add it on a heavy level. And I was able to, right, I could take care of Sugar Hill Gang, and I could take care of so much up to about, like, I could put in Beastie Boys, right? I could do all this stuff. But up to about 1992 to 1995, I start hitting this dead end a little bit. But at least I got some things started, and then dialoguing with the students about where does this need to go? Because, mumble rap, I don't listen to that. And personally, I don't care for it much, but I'm not the one that gets to make the choice as a client as to what I listen to, right? That's their decision. And you all may really resonate with that in a way that I don't, because there are cultural shifts and cultural differences. So, and I don't even know if it's officially called mumble rap. That's just what I've heard. But the point being right, hip hop culture is shifted, and we need to take that into account. We needed to add funk. We needed to add Afro punk. We needed to add disco. We needed to add a lot more in terms of country and Western music, Motown, right? So many genres that needed to be added to this song list. And so I've gotten it started, but I can only do so much. And the other faculty need to be involved. Grad students need to be involved. Freshmen need to be involved. Every undergraduate student needs to be involved. This idea of dialogue that I kind of moved away from, but I'm coming back to, is asking them the question, Where does this need to go? What do you think? And we have a discussion about those things. And it's already brought up really interesting topics. For example, when they see a song by Megan Thee Stallion on there and they say, I don't know if I'm comfortable singing that song. And I say, that's an interesting thought. Why don't we talk about the challenges with that? Our level of comfort singing a song. What does that bring up in terms of the client relationship, in terms of the therapeutic process, if we're seeking to listen to a song or to recreate it? So we've had really interesting discussions about some things that perhaps the field has not paid close enough attention to.
Hearing everything that you're saying, one of the big takeaways that I'm getting, separate from like what the listener may be receiving, is this idea of you're being innovative through your open conversations with your students, recognizing that they have expertise in areas that you may not have those experiences in, which I think can be a very difficult thing to do as somebody in this idea of a hierarchy system of education. And is wonderful. And as you're talking about all these genres and artists, one of the first things that comes to my mind and something that I harp on within my own practice is this idea that genres also don't necessarily belong to like a certain group of people, but also acknowledging where they did come from. So the biggest example that comes to mind is within country music and how that's represented within the charts and things like that. For instance, an example that's coming to mind that is a little bit outdated, but we'll just go with it, would be Lil Nas X and this idea of Old Town Road and how it was categorized as an urban song, even though it's like very customarily country in the content and the way it's structured. It has a beat to it, but that's just an adaptation that he made. And recognizing that there are people from different backgrounds who also are producing music. And if you have a client from a certain background that mimics, it could be more effective for them, as well as electronic music. Thinking about popular music now is shifting to more electronic background. And how do we take that and apply it to our instruments that aren't necessarily electronic instruments? How can we adapt that?
Yeah, that's a great question too. So, and feel free to chime in at any point on this. What I'm hearing is that challenge of, in part, maybe this isn't the whole thing, but in part, how do we replicate music the way it exists to maintain the integrity of that music? Is that part of what you're asking?
Part of that, yes.
Yes. Okay. Well, let me start there, and then you can dovetail from there. We need, on the instruments that we have, the technical capacity to be musical. We need the musical capacity in order to maintain the integrity of the song. With those two things in mind, when I teach percussion, I need to be able to teach you how to play a bass note and, at a minimum, a tone, so that you have two notes to work with and you can emulate a drum set. I can give you three, and then you can do some things with a little more variance in it, if I can get you to play that slap too, right? The way I usually teach on a djembe or on a frame drum is to start with the tradition itself so that you understand that and maintain the integrity where that came from. There is a lineage in regard to hip hop culture that can be taken back specifically to the griot and to West Africa, where the djembe was created. And, Dr. Susan Hadley wrote about that. The griot tradition still exists in the singers and the poets and the players of many instruments. The djembe isn't specific to the griot. The djembe is more of a community folk instrument. But there are many instruments that the djembe accompanies, and the griot play that. So now, that being said, we have this long lineage. If I'm able to listen to Old Town Road and hear what's going on in terms of the beat, I should have the technical capacity to play it. That's the way that I teach percussion, right? That's what needs to happen. But that also happens with guitar. I've spent a whole lot of time trying to say, we can't just walk around with 5 strums and 3 finger picking patterns. So how about we create a set of 100 strumming patterns that deal with all types of mutes, so that we understand how to play that in combination with different strumming patterns at different speeds, so that I can play funk or disco or emulate something percussion-wise on the guitar. It gives me a backbeat that helps give that potential as well. So I think about technically what's happening that gives someone the opportunity to play a genre or style. Now, all of that said, whatever instrument we're playing, there are still moments where we're going to struggle with that. And I still struggle with that. I can pull up a song, even something like Katie Tungsten's Dark Horse and a Cherry Tree. I can play that song and I can play it like she does, but I can't play it up to tempo like she does. She's a beautifully aggressive player on the guitar. I love watching her play, and she's incredibly innovative. If you ever watch her loop her own stuff, there are great videos of her doing that. But I can't play it up to tempo. And if I really wanted to do that, well, that's tough to do. There are other things that, I'll listen to and I'll just be like, wow, that's going to take me some time to get to that. We all run into that situation. Why don't I just play the recorded music then? Why do I have to decide that I have to play it live? And it's a good thing, I think, that we've said, don't use recorded music if you don't have to. But we've probably slid the pendulum too far that way now. And we've created situations where we don't maintain the authenticity of the music. The client looks at us and goes, that doesn't work.
We've all had that moment. Yeah.
Yeah. And maybe it's playing the recorded music, but then doing something under it that we're capable of too, right? That's an option that's available to us.
No, absolutely. That just sounds like we're tying it into what we were talking about earlier with, what's the purpose of this music? If it's to verbally process the lyrics afterwards, yeah, play the recording. If you're with an older adult center and they really need that individual one-on-one time in a group, it's pretty hard to be playing that while managing a group while making sure that they don't hit each other with beach balls. Like, what is the purpose behind it and how it influences? So yeah, I think that was really well said.
And I appreciate you bringing it back to, well, it depends, right? Right. That's the whole thing, is it depends on what's going on. What is the intention, purpose, outcome, whatever word we want to use there. And can we get to that place authentically?
And to accurately replicate music and things like that, what types of instruments do you think should be, now that we know where music's going and how it has changed, which ones do you think should be included in education or musicianship? Or what types of, not only instruments, but we can take that into courses as well to include like electronic instruments and things like that?
Yeah, so, we certainly have those four pillars as we talked about: voice, guitar, piano, percussion. Percussion seems to be the kind of the fourth on the list usually. It's getting better. Those are not the only instruments we use. The ukulele, and I'm probably butchering it when I say it, but everyone understands what I mean, is also an important instrument. It's got a different timbre. It's got a different volume level. It's more portable than a guitar. There's certain strengths that it has, and so it's a useful instrument. Orff instrumentation, which we can relate to percussion too, but Orff instrumentation is worth noting. The auto harp has some particular contextual locations for use, just because it's such a broad stringed instrument that you can get really nice, glissandoed sounds and use that in important ways, such as for helping someone with breath support or working on gait training. And I don't think it's the only instrument that needs to be used, but it's one that's useful in those contexts. And yes, music technology. So I've been looking around, trying to glean a better understanding of what's out there right now and what can be useful. So I've downloaded the Koala app. I've been messing around with that. Been looking at this thing called the The Artiphone. Let me see. Well, I'll have to tell you later. It's this little instrument about this big. It's a little cylinder, and it can act as a drum machine, as a synthesizer, and you can move it around and bend notes. Like, it's very interesting what it can do. So it can act as a shaker by itself. So it's a very kinesthetic electronic instrument. It's different than most. I'm really interested in, although I've not used one, which is surprising given the instruments that I do play, but I'm interested in working more with a looper, a kind of looping machine, for beat making and creating loops so that you have something that already sets the musical foundation for what you want to do. And that's a really comfortable way to explore improvisation, right? For a lot of people, everything's already there and you give them something safe to play on top of it. So those are some of the things that have been of interest to me recently. I'm familiar with, software on the computer and GarageBand, and that stuff's really important too. But I think people are more familiar with that. I think the kind of live electronic percussion is what I'd like to see more of personally.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just from individuals that I've seen too, it's shifting towards a lot of applications as opposed to instruments themselves. So the instrument could be the device that you can use for other things. Talk about the accessibility of getting that in the first place. But once you have it, you can have your instruments with you and you can take them anywhere. Most people have a phone that is a smartphone, so you can bring those with you if you need to apply them to breathing techniques, things like that. One of the wonderful apps that I like to use is called Relax Melodies, and I'll put that in the link description as well. But individuals can scaffold their soundscape to whatever they like, which is really great if you're talking about the characteristics of the music, because if they feel more relaxed with rain sounds, you can add those in. But also, we don't know their backgrounds. Maybe they had a traumatic experience in the rain. So they can also take that out, put in the sound of wind or chimes or something. So it's a very interesting one. And I know individuals at KU specifically have used, it's like a board game. Board game is not the right way to say it, but it's a game called Drop Mix, where it's a board and you have all these cards. I'll put a link to that as well. But each one contains different characteristics of different songs. So you can have the strum of, let's say, Baby by Justin Bieber, but you can have the beat of a song by TLC or something. And it'll make them work together and put them in the same key with like the bass line and everything as well. So it's really cool.
Wow, that's really cool. So I did look up that instrument I was talking about. Artophone is the company and Orba is the name of the instrument, ORBA.
I think that'll be very useful for a lot of people to see. Also, an instrument from the 90s that I think is underutilized. It had its little moment in the early 2000s, I think, is the Q chord. Talk about a portable instrument that can do so much. It has different beats from all sorts of cultures. There's extensions that you can add to it to add more. I was really hoping that they would make an updated one because it's tactile. You can feel the vibrations. Just a fantastic instrument.
Yes, absolutely agreed. I played the generation before that. Omnichord was it called? And then it changed to Q chord. But I wasn't aware that they were not making it anymore. That is a bummer.
I don't think so. I can't say for sure. But
oh, okay.
I haven't seen one where you can like plug in a song or anything from your phone. That being said, I think it's about the time that we typically take our commercial break. So stay tuned. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. We just got done talking about all these really interesting and fascinating ways to incorporate electronic instruments and music and applications. And with that, I wanted to ask you, Dr. Matney, what do you think is the validity of having individuals master their auditioning instruments within a music therapy degree?
That's a great question, and it's a really timely question. This is something that I think is being discussed amongst faculty pretty clearly right now. I think it's also being talked about on Twitter, at least just a little bit. I've seen just little glimpses of this, and I think the question is well posed. Music therapy, over time, has developed its own base of knowledge and its own value in a way that has increasingly differentiated it from certainly music performance, but also certainly music education. And the majority of places where music therapy is taught occurs in a school of music with music performance and music education, umbrellaed by the National Association for Schools of Music, which provide guidelines. Now, the first thing I do want to say is that the guidelines by NASM, is the kind of the way we pronounce the acronym, the guidelines that NASM presents are actually pretty flexible, and that each university has to make decisions about how their programs, all of them, are going to look, including a music therapy program. So I want to start there. The consideration of beginning with a primary instrument has some, in my opinion, some value, because someone has studied their musicianship over time to get to a place and has worked hard for that, to be able to demonstrate their musicianship on a level to show they can be competent in some type of musicianship at the university level. I think there is a value to that audition process in some ways. The tendency, though, has been in music education in the United States for certain instruments, to the ones that are played in bands and orchestras, to pretty much predominate the field. There's an expectation that one has played some level of classical music, be it in a choir, be it in a wind ensemble, so on and so forth. Now, to some degree, there's an exception to that because of jazz ensembles as well. But to some degree, the jazz ensembles still run into similar situations. There is a particular Eurocentric bent to that, even though it is a diverse, jazz itself is incredibly diverse, right? All of that being said, I personally see some value in someone auditioning on their instrument and developing to some degree their understanding of musicianship on that instrument. The question that you pose is, how long should that occur? Is that fair?
Yes, that is fair.
And I'm sorry, I keep going kind of back into history, but that's what I always do.
I think that's very useful to a lot of people who have not looked into it as much.
What I've kind of described up to this point, I refer to as the conservatory model. By conservatory model, what I mean is there is an idea that music is taught largely from an 18th century European mindset that focuses on musicianship largely from that period. So when I say conservatory model, I'm not just saying what happens at a conservatory. I'm saying that just about every university thinks about music in this way. And there are some limitations to that. And as the field of music therapy grows and differentiates itself in our use of popular music, folk music, rock music, metal, punk, funk, disco, jazz, blues, Motown, so on and so forth, EDM music, trance music, so many genres that I can't even keep up with anymore. What are the values of those music in a school of music? Usually they're not studied. If they are, not too much. Usually they are not practiced.
In many cases, those genres are steered away from. Like, at least from my experience, as a student, I was deterred from going into those things.
And so we have somewhat the acceptance of jazz, right? But sometimes, at least in some schools, it's still not seen quite as the same. It's a little bit different. I'm glad it's taught. I'm glad it's studied. But the fields of musics that exist are so vast now. And the ways that we as music therapists use those musics are also so vast. And we are not focusing as much, if any, on those the way that we should. Why are we not doing that? Because we don't have the space to do that. Why don't we have the space to do that? Yes, I'm getting up on my soapbox, and I'm so sorry, Brian, but I think about 4 semesters of theory. I think about 4 semesters of classical piano. I think about 2 or 3 semesters of music history. I think about the amount of time spent in private lessons on that primary instrument, being 1 hour of lessons per week with pretty rigorous schedule of expectation in terms of juries and performance and development and recital eventually, and so on and so forth. It seems like the conservatory model is alive and well, and it seems like the timeline is such that it makes it challenging for us to work on the things in regard to the musics that we use and the relevance to our work. So how much do I think it should occur? I don't think it necessarily should occur as much as most universities have it. Should we have 8 semesters and a recital on a primary instrument? I don't know if the field requires that. I'm being a little politically safe here.
Yes.
But I think the question is worth posing.
Absolutely. And there was a lot to dissect from what you said. One of the things that come to mind when you were mentioning all the genres and things is also having, and as we've kind of spoken about the whole time, is a cultural competency within those genres, and recognizing that a language of music is not the genre of music. Specifically in San Diego, where I operate from, a lot of times I have requests for various types of Spanish music. Well, you can't just be like, the Spanish song applies to everyone. There is so many dialects, correct me if I'm wrong, but dialects within Spanish. There are rancheras, there are salsa, there's flamenco, completely different styles. So this idea of even touching on other cultures, what should the expectation be for that multiculturalism within undergraduate learning? Which is a bold question for me to ask you. And maybe one that's not fair for you to answer, but I thought it'd be interesting for you to talk on it.
Well, I think it's a very fair question to ask, actually. Brian, I don't know if we've talked about this or not. One of the publications that I was honored to have the opportunity to complete with a colleague, Christina Stock, who lives in the Dallas, Texas area, she and I noticed this about, 15 years ago, maybe a little less than that, 13 years ago. We weren't teaching musics of different cultures, and maybe we could start putting something together, at least as a resource, to help people not only learn some songs from a different culture, but to have a little bit of background about each song, right? Every song has a background. And finding out about the background in a song is really helpful if you want to use it in a clinical setting. So that this doesn't just apply to songs in Spanish, but in this particular instance, I'm talking about songs in Spanish and Portuguese. So we worked on a book. It's kind of like a real book. You open it up and there's the song and the lead sheet, and they're all folk songs. So we're not, taking something from someone's intellectual property, but trying to expose people to, here are some musics from different places and here's some background and history about this song. That book was an absolute joy. Fortunately, online opportunities are probably much stronger than they were back then, so you can find things more readily. Your point's really well taken. Well, I come back to the conservatory model, and the conservatory model has a bias towards European thinking, towards white thinking, largely. Now, that's not to say that there aren't professors within that are trying to change that. I do think that that's happening, and I think it has to happen. We have to look at, even in music theory, right? If you're really paying attention, all of these things that we're talking about happen in many cultures in other ways with different names that are just as valid as the ways that we learn them. And sometimes they're describing things that we haven't described in our music. And that's what makes for a really rich musical experience. Am I getting to anything that you're asking about?
I think you're doing a great job of talking about the points. This is a very big topic, so full disclosure, I lose myself sometimes in discussions that are this vast, and I love them. But yeah, I think absolutely with what you're saying regarding knowledge of where these songs come from and having those resources accessible online and things like that.
It's really important for us as music therapists to demonstrate cultural reverence and to do our best to do so musically. And right now, I think your point is well taken, that in a few areas, our focus during an undergraduate degree is in other areas that to some degree are absolutely important, right? Could I see us operating with absolutely no music theory? I couldn't see us doing that. But what if music theory was re-envisioned in a way that integrated music therapy, like having a music theory course that was focusing on the therapeutic function of music and the characteristics of music? That's what I'm interested in. So I don't want to come across as overly critical here. I'm okay with coming across as critical, but I also want to say, what if we re-envision these things in a way that helps music therapy students make those connections quickly and to do it more efficiently for them so that they feel really ready and comfortable to go out in the field in a diverse and complex world with clients that we want to serve.
And that absolutely sounds like where it's headed. I'm taking that into a different context here, but for like psychology, the way that we have neuroscience and music therapy classes, music therapy and oncology classes. I don't think it's a stretch with the amount of research that has been published at this time and the leaders in the field that we could have that rolled out. The question is how long, that's the big kicker to all these types of discussions.
Yeah.
I would like to direct some of the listeners to an amazing published book that has really influenced my life as an individual and as a music therapist in particular. And that is the Cultural Intersections of Music Therapy book. And it just really does a great job of tying in individuals who have these lived experiences from these different cultures and hearing from their perspectives of how you can begin the process of being competent not being a destination, but more of a journey, and learning about how to be culturally reverent. And I think one of those, just a small example, one of those instances is with a family that I have for a medically fragile child from a Korean background. And the first time I saw them, I hadn't gotten to read the chapter at that time, which I could go into having access to reading articles and all of that. This is very layered, but essentially the idea that at the end of sessions, they would offer me like small things. And I didn't feel comfortable because I'm already getting paid for these sessions. And then as I looked into, the research more and learned about the culture, it's actually super rude to deny those small things. And when I first denied it, we had this kind of, it was awkward, I guess. It was like a pause and like, wait, I haven't had somebody reject like one of these things before. I don't think it was detrimental to the relationship. Since then, we've figured it out. But yeah, that's just a small example outside of music context, but as a therapist of how it's really important to know those contexts.
Absolutely. And Brian, I'll share with you that also crosses over into education of music therapy students. We're in a place where we want to see more diversity and equity and inclusion in our field. It's time for us to pay very close attention to the rich musical backgrounds of students from different cultures and to meet them where they are. I had a wonderful student at Nazareth, actually, who brought in her studied instrument from China to play for a session. And she asked me nervously if she could do that. And I said, absolutely. Not only can you do that, I strongly encourage you to take that opportunity. The instrument's kind of like the kin, and I'm probably butchering the name. It's kind of like a hammered dulcimer, and I don't know if you know what that is. I mean, that's kind of our most European equivalent, but it's tuned differently. It's a different scale. And she was absolutely masterful on it and brought it in to play with a client, and they had a wonderful conversation about it. It was such a neat experience. It was, I think it was really affirming and validating for her. If we want to see this field progress, we need to pay more attention to the music, not only from other cultures that come from other countries, but from the cultures that exist here in the United States. I'd love to be able to play funk better. If a student can teach me that, I am all about it. I am in, right? So if there is a student who's strong in that, because that's a part of their background and culture, I would love to be a part of that. The same goes for any genre. That's just one isolated example of an area that I can learn from somebody else. And I want to be there to validate and affirm their musical experiences. So I come back kind of to that question that we asked. Is there room and space in today's schools of music, larger than just the music therapy program, but in the schools of music, for that kind of dialogue, for that kind of affirmation, and for us to create that kind of musical community together? I just posed the question, and I think it's worth asking.
Thinking about all these things and how they interact, we are unfortunately reaching the end of our timeline for today's episode, but I think that's a really great question to leave everyone with. I do want to give you the opportunity to leave any summarizing thoughts or like take home's conclusion part of the statements that we've made today, as well as anything that you would like to plug for yourself, as well as, different resources of how people can contact you.
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you for your time. I really appreciate it, Brian. It's always a pleasure to talk with you, and to do it in this venue is a joy. My summarizing thoughts, I fear that I'm going to go for too long, but when I think about our discussion today, I appreciate the opportunity to be able to talk about the importance of a new burgeoning type of musicianship in music therapy that is expanding our scope, that is expanding our understanding and knowledge and our ability to connect with our clients. I see the potential for all sorts of new research to be conducted from a variety of theoretical standpoints that will continue to strengthen the field. And I can't wait for that to continue, not only with my generation, but with yours and the generations that are coming up. One of the freshman students made a quick mention in one of her written assignments about how she views the therapeutic process and the importance to make a client comfortable enough to be vulnerable so that they, the client, can grow through the session process. And I just thought how incredibly and immediately insightful of that person to understand what that means and what that means musically. So wanted to share that. Better to share something from one of my students than from myself. I can be reached at matneyb@ku.edu. I'm always happy to dialogue when I have time. Sometimes I'm busy, but I also like to answer emails quickly, as you know, Brian. So when I'm able to get to people, I do my best to do it. If you happen to be interested in the book I mentioned, which is called Roots and Branches, it's up on Amazon. You can also find it at sarsonpublishing.com, which will take you to the Amazon site until I update it, hopefully this winter break, and you can actually buy it directly on the website. And then I also have a book called Tataku, The Use of Percussion in Music Therapy, which is kind of what started this whole endeavor for me and my passions and interest. So again, Brian, thank you. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedule to do it. And links to all of those will be in the description as well. So you all will be able to find that either on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, et cetera, et cetera. But I want to thank you for taking the time, and I appreciate it.
Thank you.
If you'd like to see today's guest or learn more about the show, check us out on Facebook or Instagram at Voices of Music Therapy or on Twitter at VOMT Podcast. If you have any questions or if you know any innovative music therapist and would like to recommend them for the show, you can email us at voicesofmusictherapy@gmail.com.